You are listening to the Information Security Innocent Podcast, episode 43, originally released on February 4th, 2021. As always, I'm your host, Josh Amishav. Today we have Robert RSnake Hansen on the show. Robert has been in AppSec for over 25 years, since essentially it was CGI security. He's probably most known for hackers.org, which is where I pretty much started my journey in hacking, and is now the CTO of BitDiscovery. My three main takeaways from our conversation were: 1, where he sees the future of data privacy going forward; 2, why he started taking snapshots of the internet to predict stock prices; and 3, if he ran hackers and slackers again today, what security controls he would do differently. You'll enjoy those two things plus a bunch of other tips along the way. Direct support for this podcast comes from BreachSense. According to the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, stolen credentials are consistently one of the most common methods used in hacking-related breaches. It's no wonder when the average user recycles the same password across 4 different accounts. BreachSense gives security teams visibility into their clients, employees, and third-party suppliers' breach credentials before criminals exploit them. Go to breachsense.io/contact to apply for your free 7-day trial. And now, here's my conversation with Robert. Robert Hansen, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Josh.
It's great to have you here. So I have a couple topics I want to cover, but first I want to get your views on some privacy-related issues. Where do you see privacy headed, both from a personal standpoint and from a corporate standpoint?
Well, yeah, that's a fantastic question. The short answer is badly in both in both directions. It's headed in bad directions. I think the UK and the EU have started to realize, and through balkanization have sort of enforced a level of individual privacy that we haven't really seen in the United States. But I think the United States is probably not just far along from a legal perspective, but far along in consumer understanding of how bad the problem actually is. It's funny, I was talking with this kid just the other day, and he was talking about Google. He's like, "Why don't you like Google?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't like it because you don't know what they're doing to you." And he's like, "What are they doing to me?" I'm like, "Exactly, exactly. That's my problem." Like if you look at the homepage of Google, like you search for like hotels in Austin or something, everything above the fold, every single thing above the fold is a Google link. Like at the top you have like Gmail and whatever. Below that you have like Google Images and shopping or whatever. Then you have this big map of Austin and a bunch of different, things you can look at or whatever. And it's not till you scroll down, half a page or a full page down, you'll finally get the actual listings, actual, organic search. And it's that kind of thing, that slow progression towards pushing your eyeballs towards things they control. It's so imperceptible and people don't even notice it's happening. And then, they traverse, every single web page you visit with Google Analytics, or if you type a search into some website, you're probably hitting a Google search, so you're actually hitting Google before you come back. Or you're probably using Google Fiber now. You probably have Android phone. You're using Google, Picasa, you're using Google Maps. Like, they know so much about people as they traverse their life, that they've been able to do things like give up the ability to read your email. They said we don't need it anymore, which should terrify you, because that means they have better information and telemetry than they get out of your email. So that should be terrifying. And so companies like Apple, for all their faults, I'm not saying they're perfect or anything, have started to realize that there's money to be made in protecting people's privacy, and big money actually. They're one of the, if not the most profitable company in the world, depending on the month. And they've realized that they can create these little windows into the internet that don't necessarily have to be tied to your user persona in a way that any other company can track you. Now they can still track you. They got iMessage and iCloud and all that stuff. But if they, double pinky swear promise not to look in your data or use it to monetize outside of getting you to buy their physical products, then theoretically you're getting a reasonable, good consumer experience, but you're paying for it. So instead of you being the product, you are now paying for this enhanced privacy thing. So it really feels like we're getting to further and further class-based privacy approach to security. Like if you can pay for privacy, you get some of it. If you can't, if you can pay for your VPN and an extra computer that doesn't have anything else on it that's tied to you or whatever, yeah, you can carve out a small amount of privacy. You can get around the internet without people knowing who you are. But for the average consumer who really just can't afford to figure all that stuff out or the actual literal cost, I think there's a massive backslide in the amount of privacy people are able to have on the internet.
And from a corporate standpoint?
Corporations, I think, have learned a little bit of a lesson. I'm hearing more companies reasonably say, why are we keeping this data? Why is this around? Do we need it? Do we actually need it? Is it one of those things? Now, it's not to say that they aren't still keeping it, but at least they're asking the question now. And gradually over time, there's going to be enough of these data breaches that I think it's going to convince boards to start saying, hey, let's get rid of this data we don't need. I had an interesting conversation with a company that does, some interesting security stuff, and they were talking with Dropbox at one point, and Dropbox apparently said, "Well, we're not willing to turn on all this crazy security stuff, like real key-based encryption where we don't know what this thing is. It's just an encrypted blob, because we're using it, they aren't using it, but their marketing team is worried that they'd lose visibility and eventually not be able to use it when they want to use it." And so that's the kind of thing that one half of the company realizes it's a bad idea and you shouldn't do it, and then there's marketing. And marketing always just seems to find a way to make that whole thing much more scary.
So let me ask you then, from a tactical standpoint, what search engine should you use? I mean, is DuckDuckGo, does that offer you any protection?
Well,
Still behind the same IP. So what do you do tactically?
yeah, it's the same IP address, and they're forwarding all that information to Google. So it's using the Google APIs. So Google still knows who you are because you're phoning home in 100 other ways via your IP address. So it's not really that much of a help from a real privacy perspective if you're trying to hide from Google. I don't really have a great answer for you. I think all of the search engines do a pretty bad job of really protecting you. Disconnect is another one of those. I like those guys a lot. I think they try, but ultimately they're still using Google APIs. So until someone comes up with their own search engine and just gets fully away from Google and an ad model, which is tough because that's expensive to run a search engine without ad.
But how does the Google API, what information you're sending a query, so the search string is getting sent to the Google API, but then how are they still tracking you?
You also have to send the IP address of the origin
Okay.
you made the request. There's probably some national security reasons they have to have that information, maybe, but more importantly, it's great for marketing. So they're still getting you one way or another. I have seen some people switch to Bing, and the only reason I think that's any better is just because it's not Google, not because it's they can't do exactly the same kinds of things. In fact, in some ways, I think that Microsoft could do it better, just because they were an AI-driven search engine from the bottom up, as opposed to Google, who's kind of top-down, sort of enforcing it after the fact. But I don't have a good answer for you. I think search engines are sort of a choke point, and they're a choke point that national security has taken a hard look at. I know the Yandex guys, they're very heavily tied with Putin, for instance. They bought Bleco, for instance. So you can't really escape them. There's somebody somewhere who wants to see your search queries. And the only real defense we have is hopefully they're not sharing it because it's just bad business. But technically, it's very easy for them to share that information to whomever they want. And ultimately, encryption, it will get broken. All this stuff that we're relying on will get broken. And organizations like the NSA and other very large intelligence agencies are collecting that information. So they can't encrypt it now. They can't decrypt it now. But give it another 10 years or whatever, and they totally can. And so maybe that's beyond the statute of limitations, but that's not necessarily beyond the utility. The value of that encrypted payload is still there, still something. And there's a lot of stuff
Can
weird.
you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, well, like let's say like I bought a bunch of bomb parts back in 1980 or something. That's still useful information, even though that's 30 years ago. They're still going to want to track me. Or let's say I had intimate connections with an asset who, back then he might have just been, a guy I played soccer with, but now he's some big wig at some company. That might be super useful information. They can leverage me to recreate a connection, and it would seem organic because I've known this guy for 30 years, but so they can use it to leverage human assets in interesting ways, far, far, far down the road, and you don't really think about it. And so those choke points, search engines, for instance, and email, and a handful of other things like that, chat systems, and so on, social media, those are all really great places for intelligence agencies to spend a lot of time focused on the connective tissue between those things, and just log it forever. And eventually, maybe they run out of space and they start throwing away some of the old stuff. But space is super cheap, especially if you're national security. And what we do know is organizations like China's intelligence agency has something called million grains of sand. And Million Grains of Sand is based on the premise that I may not be able to hack the person I'm interested in, like the general. He's super secure. He doesn't even have a phone. Doesn't use the internet. But he's got a maid, and he has to tell the maid, "Hey, don't show up for a couple of weeks because I'm going to be gone." Or he has a nephew who's like, "Sorry, little Timmy, I can't come to your football game or whatever. I'm going to miss it or whatever." And that general's in charge of the some fleet or whatever, so he's going to be deployed for a couple of weeks or whatever. So by virtue of knowing everything around the target, you effectively know everything you need to know about the target. And the only reason we know that's true is because Million Grains of Sand has been compromised and it's been leaked out to other intelligence agencies, which means you're thinking, oh, it's not so bad. Only one intelligence agency has all this information, but that's just not the case. A number of them do now, probably. And so building up on that, knowing things like going around and grabbing like social security and death records and birth records and whatever it is may not seem particularly useful today, but in 20 years, that's your mother's maiden name. That's your secret question to all kinds of stuff. And that's kind of how Million Grains of Sand works. It's telemetry that can be built up over time to create a very large and very robust digital footprint. And that's excluding all the crazy stuff that China is doing with, Sesame credits, which can track. It's basically like the Stasi. They know everything they need to know about you, and they can isolate you, not just like financially or making you not have a job. They can also say your friends are not allowed to be your friends anymore because we know you're a bad actor, and if they are friends with you, their credit score goes down, and they don't want their credit score to go down. So like, I better stop talking to this guy. And they know that you're making phone calls. They know you're friends on social media. They know you're sending email to one another. They know you're transacting with them. So all those things can drive down your credit score. So let's say you run a small business or something, they can drive you out of business immediately. And the really scary thing that no one seems to talk about, and it drives me crazy, is like, yes, that is all bad for Chinese citizens and terrible for them. But what's worse is they can weaponize it and point it out of China as well. So right now, it's all focused internally. It's all just like, people inside of China having problems, communicating with one another, especially if you're deemed a distant. But down the road, they say, well, Robert Hansen, you're friends with Robert Hansen, and we know Robert Hansen has an anti-Chinese viewpoint. So you can't transact with Robert Hansen. You can't ship stuff from Alibaba. You can't have corporate relationships with them. And if he even works for a company that you have a big contract with, you're like, look, we would love to send millions of dollars your way, but you have this employee and we need you to stop employing this guy because that's what XYZ problems. So eventually they'll be able to leverage that to make some very strong maneuvers outside of China. And that's what really has me scared. It's terrible for the Chinese currently, but right now it's just the beginning of what's really possible.
Would a VPN, like what protection would a VPN then? You would think that would at least protect you against Google queries. Would that help you against some of the other threats that you brought up?
So you can't. Well, first of all, this is not exactly public information yet. So, but we have some strong knowledge that a large number of the VPNs are actually run by China. Big ones too, ones that you've heard of. And so I'm actually helping out a VPN provider that's based out of the United States, and they have started doing uncovering of the real chain of who owns what in these VPN providers. Anyway, it's not public yet, but there'll be some news coming down the pipe in the not too distant future. So I'm not a fan of VPNs that I don't have very strong knowledge of who owns them, where I can go and physically interdict if I absolutely had to. And the general rule of thumb is you cannot hide anything from your VPN provider. If you're trying to hide stuff from your VPN provider, you've already lost. The other rule of thumb is if a nation
Even if you go through Tor, even if it's VPN to Tor.
Yes, because they can see that connection point between the two. Unless you're using Tor over a VPN, then all they can tell is that you are contacting Tor. But most people don't use VPNs that way. They just flip a VPN on and they're off to the races. So the second rule of thumb is if you're trying to hide stuff from national intelligence, you have to assume that or the eventual person you're connecting to, you have to assume that they're going to know whatever you're sending across the wire, and you have to assume that they can do some sort of traffic analysis before the VPN. So let's say a large chunk of data is streaming from one side of the VPN from some IP address in Austin, Texas, and then a similar amount of stream of data is coming out to Google or something. You can figure out that this person's contacting Google. And there's been similar attacks against Tor. Some guy phoned in a bomb threat, and they're like, well, who's been on Tor in the building? One person was on Tor, and they're like, well, it's probably that guy who's right there. And sure enough, it was. So similar type of traffic analysis is already being performed in a small scale. And certainly anyone who really cared about it, like national intelligence, that's not anyone using VPN is already interesting, right? You already want to know what's going on because they're probably trying to get around something, skirt something, which might be nothing, might be a terms of service thing, or it might be something. And so you really can't hide anything from national intelligence with a VPN. You have to wrap it, and then you also have to not tie it to your user persona. So if your user is Jim Bob and you log into Google as Jim Bob over a VPN, you haven't done anything. Google still knows everything. So you have to not use anything related to your user persona. And that's tricky because 90% of what people want to do online is like transact their bank or send an email or, chat with somebody on social or whatever. And so for all of those purposes, you've decloaked yourself the second you go to the website. So VPNs are only really have utility when you're trying to do a search and you don't want to tie to your user persona and you're not logged into anything and you're just surfing as if you're like an alien visiting the website for the very first time. Like, I don't know what websites even are. I'm just typing stuff in and magically stuff's popping out, and you're not gonna ever visit that site again as that user persona. It's like one shot deal. Turn off the VPN when you're done, clear cookies, clear cache, clear everything. And even that, you're thinking that's pretty good, like that's going to stop it. Well, but the problem is Google, for instance, uses safe browsing. So safe browsing queries over the VPN and says, hey, here's the microtime of the install of this browser. And so you can correlate exactly that it's this person because no two people have the same microtime of the install. So they still know who you are unless you take proactive measures and turn all that stuff off. But you have to know a lot to get past this. Like, it's not easy. It's not something the average user is just gonna like, oh, that's how to do it. That's what to do. So we're kind of in a bad position, and there's really no one I see taking really proactive measures to prevent all of this stuff.
You run a website called SmartphoneExec.
Yeah.
My understanding is you use your cell phone for as much as possible.
Well, these days since COVID, I've it's been a little bit more convenient to use a desktop, but
but let me actually pre-COVID days.
yeah,
You're
pre-COVID,
essentially walking around with a tracking device.
yeah, oh yeah,
Given all the things you just said,
yeah.
how do you handle that from a privacy perspective?
Well, I think you have to assume a couple things about me. Number one is I probably don't do that if I'm trying to get off of the internet. This is my work. When I'm working, people have to know who I am. I have to authenticate to things. I have to be doing stuff. But if I need to get off the internet from a personal perspective, I don't want my persona to be online, whether my handle or my actual user. Then I probably would not be using that as my primary means of getting on the internet. Yeah.
Okay. And somebody who has, say, data associated with their persona and wants to get rid of it, do you have any suggestions on how to do that? Do you need to, I mean, deleting it may or may not help.
May or may
put
not.
in, yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you do?
And deleting means one thing and it means another thing. Like like I had a Gmail account that I was using for testing, and I intentionally killed the session, deleted my user, whatever, and just hit refresh on the last email I had open, and it was still there. And so soft deleting is probably a better way to think of that. It's deleted in the sense that you can't access it again, or some adversary can't access it again with a username and password, but it's not necessarily deleted out of their archive. And there's lots of reasons why backups will continue to always plague you if you're trying to fully delete your information off the internet. It's funny because I went through 23andMe purely out of curiosity, and because I anticipated suing them eventually. That was actually the reason I did it. And so they eventually proved that they were untrustworthy. They gave up information about people's DNA to law enforcement, which they said they were never going to do. I knew that they would, though, and eventually they did. And so I said, okay, delete my information. They're like, okay, we're going to delete it. I'm like, well, how did you email me back if you deleted all my information? I mean, all of it. And they're like, okay, we deleted it. I'm like, you can't email me back if you've deleted all of it. That is impossible. And so I just kind of went back and forth like many times, like, I'm about to spin up a lawyer if you guys don't figure this shit out. And they never really completely did, but they're like, I could see them trying to shut down more and more, like the trouble tickets that try to like delete them, but they still email me back. And I'm like, it's not how this works.
So one of the things we talked about before we started recording was cyber insurance. And you would think that they would be in a good position, at least from a corporate standpoint, to kind of force companies to improve their privacy policies and the way they're handling data. Is that the case?
I think that's the goal. I think improving security is the goal. But really, it's funny because a lot of people think insurance companies are the bad guys, but if you really think about it from their perspective, they're trying to keep you alive as long as possible, so your premiums stay, you keep paying them out forever. They don't want you to get in car accidents because they want you to be healthy, and they don't want to have to pay all that stuff. Like, really, they're kind of on your side. Now they have a really kind of a perverse way of getting there. I'm not saying that makes me feel comfortable, but ultimately, they're on our side. They're trying to solve the same problem that we are, which is they don't want to pay out premiums, just like they don't want they don't want to pay out the cost associated with the downside. But they also don't necessarily want to jack up your premiums arbitrarily because they know you'll stop buying insurance. So they want you to handle your security. They want you to be good at your security. And so this gets to my contentious point. Like, a lot of security experts, they really believe, they see a new exploit and they're like, oh my gosh, this is the worst thing ever. And I'll literally, it's practically a daily thing. Somebody will email me like, oh my God, did you see this new thing? Like, sudo is exploitable as a local user. I'm like, that's local user. You had to give an adversary local access to your box before that's even a problem. Like, yeah, I mean, it's a problem. We need to fix it. I'm not saying don't fix it, but there's so many other problems out there and they're much, much, much worse. And the things that keep me up as a CISO are things like, web application vulnerabilities, just because they're so easy for bad guys to find, so easy, so prevalent. It's very easy to make the mistake. Even as a seasoned professional, you can still very easily fall in a trap and find. I've done it myself. I've definitely created exploits before in my code. And this is me doing it. Like I know what I'm fucking doing. I don't make mistakes like that, and yet I do make mistakes. And the other one's email. Like, it's so easy to send phishing emails or malware or whatever, that it becomes basically straight up phone calls. People calling people up. That straight up social engineering stuff. Like, you can't really stop it. It's like super prevalent. There's ways to mitigate it and reduce it. There's some interesting stuff with like phishme.com, where they can phish you and phish your users and gradually reduce the amount of times they get phished over time. It never goes to zero, but it kind of tapers off close to zero. So there's stuff you can do to kind of reduce it a little bit, but ultimately those are much more common types of vulnerabilities and much more frequently exploited to the point where they actually cause real downstream damage than just about anything else. I heard that one insurance company, the only thing they look at, other than the size of your company and the industry you're in, the only thing they look at is whether you have RDP open. If you have RDP open, they won't insure you. And not like they'll change the premiums. They just won't insure you because clearly you don't know what you're doing. Once you fix that problem, we'll insure you. And so that's fascinating. But what we have seen is, although they'll insure you for just about anything, literally the worst security I've ever seen, they'll insure it. What they won't do is pay out and then continue to be your insurance provider. And you'll basically be blacklisted. So if you care about this long term, short term, you can make any mistakes you want and you'll get one free payday out of it. You're good to go. But long term, if it's your fault, like you didn't, like, it's not like it's an O-Day. If it's an O-Day, like they'll continue to insure you. But if it's something like, I forgot to patch this super obvious WordPress vuln, like I patch everything and it's in my policies, but I just don't. Or I didn't install this anti-phishing, anti-malware software and I said I do, or whatever, where it is your fault and it would have gotten caught if you did what you said you did. I use a firewall, but you didn't, if this thing was sitting on the firewall, that kind of thing. They won't reinsure you the next time around. And what I think is going to happen is that's not going to be very good for business either. So while that's a short-term thing that they're doing, I think what's going to end up happening is, once they get enough data and they know enough about companies, and this is going to change with asset inventory and attack surface mapping. Once they understand a little bit more about what companies look like before and after they get compromised, they're going to start saying, look, we'll insure you at this premium level, but if you fix these 5 vulns, we'll reduce your premiums by this amount. If you don't fix it, okay, we'll just keep making money off of you at this higher premium rate. Like, that's totally up to you. And so they really will encourage you, by virtue of premiums, to reduce the amount of vulnerability. The other stick they have is, we'll insure you, but only up to $500,000. We're not going to take a big risk on you because you have these vulnerabilities out there. If you fix XYZ vulns out there, we'll insure you up to 2 million or 5 million or whatever the number is. And I think that's the kinds of sticks that make enterprises start going, oh crap, we really need to do this. The other thing is, they can start mandating, like, look, we're not going to give you an insurance unless you have this brand of firewall. Like, we don't like this other one over here for whatever reason. I don't necessarily know that they'd have kickbacks for making those types of recommendations, but they certainly would be making them for real business financial reasons. For instance, they know this firewall has like XYZ types of configuration problems, or they know this browser, for instance, has bad defaults or whatever. And so they can gradually, over time, start mandating more and more companies move in certain technical directions. Right now, they just don't have enough market share and they're trying to prove that there's a lot of value here, and they want everyone hooked into it, and they want enough payouts going through the system. They want to pay people out. They want to give money back to companies, so there's enough anecdotes out there like, oh, I got paid out. Hey, even me, Robert Hansen, I got some consulting gigs because some company got compromised and they wanted me to come in and do some cleanup work for them. So I know it happens, and I watch very large insurance providers saying we want more payouts. We want to find more people to give money to so that it gets out there that, hey, this is serious, where we really will give money to people who get compromised. But to do that, they need a lot more companies to buy it. And to do that, they need to reduce friction as much as possible. So no crazy premium changes, no caps, just everyone gets insurance no matter what.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You brought up asset intel. How did you, and before Bit Discovery, you were working on outside intel. How did you decide that's the problem you wanted to solve?
Well, I've long wanted to solve this problem. Like 20 years now-ish. What I originally wanted to solve it for was stock prediction. I actually ran into a guy who's possibly one of the least qualified people I've ever met in my life doing what he was doing, which is as a stockbroker. This is prior to Y2K. And he was making a ton of money. And what he said is, like, if the stock goes up a little bit and then it dips around, then it starts going up a little bit more, it'll go up way more. I'm like, what are you talking about? That's just like, that's not true. It's like statistically not true. It's very easy to prove, as a matter of fact. But he believed it. But what was really happening is the entire market was going up, and he was, just because he was in the market at all, he was making money. So after Y2K, he lost his shirt, he was out of business and everything. And I started thinking about the problem. I'm like, well, the problem isn't that there isn't a way to do analysis of stock markets. The problem is there isn't the right telemetry to do it, and or if it exists, it's too expensive, and I just, processing it's too hard, or collecting it's too hard, or whatever. But I believed even back then that there might be a way to do it. So I kind of was sitting on the idea, ruminating on what, like, internet telemetry and how you might be able to leverage it. I ran into a guy about 10 years later. It's probably one of the smartest guys I've ever met in my life. And he was talking about that game Pachinko, the game where you put in a little thing and it bounces around on a bunch of pegboards and gets in the bottom. And but you could extrapolate it to a game of pool or a game of darts if you're not familiar with that game. But he basically said it's a game of skill, not a game of luck. And I'm like, pretty sure you're wrong about that. He's like, no, it's a game of skill. It's just a skill that no human on Earth actually has. It's a skill of, it bounces off the thing. It has a certain kinetic energy, the coefficient of friction on the fabric, the elasticity of the bars. Like, these are things that are real things in nature that can be measured. It's just that you and I as human beings can't eyeball it. We can't do the math in our head. And I'm like, ooh, you're totally right. And furthermore, I think that whole idea I had of just having more telemetry, having more of it, would finally give me the kind of resolution I'd need to start doing that type of analysis. But again, even then, the data just wasn't there. The software necessary to make it happen didn't exist. Like, I was way too early, like, literally a decade too early still, even at that point. So around like 5-6 years ago, there was a change to the Linux kernel that allowed you to make more than open more than 65,000 ports at once by not opening ports, basically, those sort of ghost ports. And suddenly, instead of me being able to scan IPv4 space for a single port in like a week or 2 weeks or whatever, I could do it in a few minutes. And that changed the ball game. That made it really possible for a lot of researchers to start building different scanning technologies. It also made it possible to start collecting it en masse in like large chunks of data. The time spans wasn't so long that I'd have to like chunk it up into different time slots. It's like, this is like one timestamp, here's another timestamp, which was really useful for stock prediction, because if you were trying to look at a graph, you want it to be blocked out by time, not just here's some data. That's just not that useful. And then the other thing that changed around that same time period is that there was a tsunami that went through and like wiped out Indonesia, and so that drove up drive prices for years. But right around that time, after the years were up, drive prices finally came down again. You could finally buy, a multi-terabyte drive for, $1,000 or something, which is, back then it would have been like double or triple that. And it finally came down in price. You could finally start putting like a lot of stuff. And literally, I just built this thing in my basement. I literally just started constructing this thing in my basement to do stock prediction. And when I went down the path of actually trying to monetize it, it was really, really fascinating. So I actually was talking with this one hedge fund manager in the UK. He's like, Robert, I see like people try to pitch me on their ideas that do something similar, like practically once a week, twice a week, something like that, like very often. He's like, yours is the first I've seen that I think would actually work. Like all these others are like they're wonderful ideas, but they'd never work. Yours is the first I've seen that I think would actually work. He's like, the problem is the way the investment strategies work for hedge funds. I have a very specific trading strategy that I have to follow, and I cannot just arbitrarily switch it to use your data. And if I lost for any money for any reason, and somebody asked and said, why did you make this trade? And I said, it's because of this thing that's outside of my trading strategy. I'm opening myself up to liabilities. So despite the fact he agreed with me, I still couldn't make a go of it. So gradually I was looking for other homes for it, sales enablement or asset management or insurance modeling, because that's all these things are things I know about and I could definitely go tackle. And then Jeremiah was like, "No, let's do it for asset management." Like he'd been wanting to do it for a while, and I finally built it anyway. I'm like, "Look, it could be used for your thing too." Like I built this thing, and he's like, "Yeah, let's do it." So we started Bit Discovery, and it's been happily ever after.
So you're essentially taking like snapshots of the internet at different timestamps. How does one build telemetry around there's different data types. There's I don't know what you're specifically collecting, but like there's historical DNS data, there's data you can extrapolate from SSL certificates, there's even password breaches. How does one build something bigger but based on that information?
Yeah, well, it depends on what you're trying to build. So, like insurance modeling, you don't need much more than that. Like that's a pretty good indicator. But there's companies that do additional stuff out there that are pretty interesting. So, it depends. On the stock prediction side, I'll give you a couple of examples. I'm not going to give away all my special sauce, but I'll give some. One example, if you do like an overlapping least square regression on like whatever it is, like who is data or zone data or DNS data or whatever it is, the thing that you think might be correlated to the stock, and you time shift it by some amount of time, let's call it a month, 2 month, whatever. You can and you reduce it to like basically ones and zeros or percentages of ones and zeros. You can basically create a graph that'll show you whether it's correlated or not. And an example of that would be like over time, let's say you have a company that's somehow its DNS, let's say, is tied to its customer base. So like customer A.company.com, customer B.company.com, et cetera, right? And you see that is the number of customers they have is directly correlated to their stock price by virtue of the fact that that is how much money they're going to be making in that quarter, so you can predict earnings. So over time, you see that graph going up. It's going up, going up, and going up, and then it's time shifted a certain amount of time, and then as a lagging effect, you see the stock do something. So you move that forward, so it's correlated, so it's on the same timestamp, and then you can see, when this stock goes up, when the stock goes up, it correlates directly to the DNS being up, and vice versa. If you see it go down, you'll see a time lag version before the street knows about it, and then it'll go away. So like my favorite example is when Rackspace, they were going along, steady state, pretty much a little bit of growth, but not much. And then they had like a sine wave, a square sine wave that went up, went over, and then went back down, almost the same place they were before, and then stayed stable. And I'm like, what the fuck is going on? I could not figure it out. So I did a delta between the early timestamps and the last timestamps, and there was almost no correlation. I think there was like 0.01% correlation or something crazy, something super small, which means they had done a data center migration. They had moved from one location to another location. And when I did an analysis of that, what I realized is that Rackspace was going to miss earnings, and sure enough, they absolutely missed earnings, and because MailChimp is their biggest customer, and that was a very good indicator, precursor indicator that a stock price was going to move on Rackspace. So that's one example. Another example is you can often predict what companies are going to be doing by virtue of what domains they register. So like for a long time now, I've been watching companies like Altria and Philip Morris and different tobacco manufacturers, they're just buying up an enormous amount of marijuana websites. Enormous. So they're about to make a big play because they're betting on legalization in the United States. I mean, most people who can think about it for 10 seconds can say that's true, but I can prove it. I know exactly what they're doing as opposed to just conjecture. And then another example, this is my last one. Let's say you have a drug manufacturer or like a car manufacturer or something, and you're like, you find this website that's like their staging site, or their dev site, or whatever. And oftentimes the staging sites are precursors to what this company will actually be launching or doing in the future. Like with tomorrow's timestamp, you'll see that something bad will be happening. Like, oh, this drug, it turns out it kills people. Or the chairman's stepping down for sexual abuse cases, or this car turns out it drives people off the road, or whatever. You can predict what's going to happen because you're looking at tomorrow's press release without having to hack them, without having to do anything interesting. You're just like looking right at it. So those kinds of things give me an enormous amount of insight into what companies are doing. I've never actually traded on the data, but it's quite easy to see how you might make a lot of money doing it.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. How did you get started pre-eBay, pre-Slackers hackers? How did you get into hacking?
I think I was always kind of a miscreant kid. I just was always looking for something to do that was outside of the norm, and I had some very miscreant friends, and they kind of led me down I wouldn't say a super bad path, but down the wrong direction. And so I learned a lot very early on about developing. My very first program I ever wrote was a Trojan horse, for instance, that I wrote on my own, other than Hello World kind of thing.
In what language?
It was very embarrassingly in many languages because I didn't know enough of one language to make it happen. So some of it was shell script, some of it was Perl, some of it was C. I couldn't figure out how to turn off the prompt, so I had to switch to C for that last part. So anyway, yeah, it's just as terrible as it sounds. I was a bad programmer. I'm not a great programmer today, but back then it was even worse. But then gradually I started EHAP, Ethical Hackers Against Pedophilia, and we actually did some actually at the time the biggest takedown of child pornographers in history. By today's standards, it's stupid small. I think we had like 32 or something, and now Innocent Images will bust 100 people at a time. Just it's like it's Tuesday, we're going to do 100, just to scare people because obviously they've got more than 100 ready to go. But I kind of looked at myself in the mirror and I'm like, you know what? I don't like it. I don't like this feeling of being a bad guy in the daytime and a good guy at night. And so I stopped pretty much everything bad I was doing. I was also running webfringe.com, which was a top 100 list. It was the very first way that hackers could get in touch with each other outside of a web ring. Because before that, I'm talking about websites here, not like a chat or whatever. Web rings, we actually had the second web ring on Earth. The first one was webring.com. The second one was Fringe of the Web. But the problem with web rings, a hacker web ring, is eventually the hacker websites go offline. So if you miss 4 or 5 in a row, you can't get to the next part of the web ring. So I always thought that design was really terrible. And I'm like, you know what? We need to do something different. So I created a top 100 list. If you send us traffic, that means you must be alive. You must exist. And I don't mean like real traffic. I just mean have a little image on your web page so I know you exist. And you'll get to the top 100 list. And as you fall off, then it kind of naturally heals itself. And then, I was working for Digital Island, Cable and Wireless, Exodus Communications, all those different companies, kind of one massive company. Oh, I worked for DoubleClick for a while. ValueClick for a while, which eventually got bought by DoubleClick. So did a lot of anti-click fraud detection stuff back then. Which is partially why I know so much about Google, because they have some of my code effectively. And then went off to do product management, which is really kind of how I got started in the more business side of security. And what I learned over there was that there was a pretty massive problem in how networking worked. There was these things called looking glasses. And I'm like, I don't get why I can run arbitrary commands on a web page that runs arbitrary commands on a router that people rely on. That sounds like a terrible idea. But it got my mind going in a different direction. I'm like, I bet there's a way in JavaScript, or I was thinking Java. I think there's a way in Java that if you're running it in a browser, local browser context, you can hack things inside of networks. And so when I did eventually meet Jeremiah Grossman, I pitched it to him. I'm like, look, I know who you are. Like, I've heard about you before. You're one of the very few people in WebAppSec that I can pick out by name. I have this idea. He's like, and he knew who I was too. I'm like, I have this idea. I think there's a way to do it in Java. And he's like, okay, cool. Like, I think I know how to do this. I'm like, great. If you can do it, we'll split the credit for it. It's just an idea I've had for a long time. I've never had time to actually sit down and do it, especially because I was working at eBay at the time. And so he went off and built it in Java, a script. And so once it was built, we finally broke the concept of a firewall, or at least broke it in the sense that if you have arbitrary JavaScript running in a browser, I can do anything I want to your internal network effectively, as long as it's something that can be reached by a browser, a port that's reachable. So I think that's kind of how I got down that path. Hackers.org was more just a place for me to throw shit that I didn't know where to put anything else. So I put the cheat sheet there. Eventually, I started getting more and more hackers to visit it, so I could track them and see them doing stuff on eBay. So they would go to my cheat sheet, they'd copy paste, they put it in eBay, they'd hit the button, it would work, and then they'd run it for a while, and then I'd go, okay, no more of that. I'd block it, and I'd see them go, try it, fail. I'm like, go back to hackers.org, pull another one, put it back at eBay. I'm like, this is really hilarious. So I learned a lot.
That's great.
I learned a lot from hackers.org. I had about 25,000.
So that was essentially a big honeypot.
Well, it didn't really start off that way, and it didn't really end that way. But in the middle there, it kind of was by virtue of the fact that people were using it in that way, and only for eBay. I wasn't using it for anybody else. But the actual reason I stopped doing it was there was a company that was doing pen testing work for eBay, and they started doing it. And then they submitted one of the vectors that they'd found to hackers.org. They're like, hey, by the way, this works. And so I put it in there, and then I checked to see if anyone had done it, and I saw them doing it. And so I kicked them off of eBay, and then they emailed me at eBay, and they're like, hey, we found this new vector, blah, 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 because they hadn't checked to see if it was still working. And I'm like, yeah, I know about that one, thanks. And they're like, oh shit, you must be the same, like that. That's too convenient that you had, like, they figured it out. I'm like, okay, I got to stop using it that way. So ever since then, I never did it that. But it was a great way to learn about bad guy activity, more just so that I knew what logs looked like that were going to be good, ones that were clearly about to become bad. And that's how I wrote the book Detecting Malice, which was originally called The First 100 Packets. The premise of that book started off being, I can detect that you're going to become bad within the first 100 packets of your visit. And that's obviously not completely true. And there's certain circumstances where people are just visiting the site for the very first time and whatever. So the first half of the book is about the first 100 packets. The second half of the book is about sort of long tail fraud stuff. And so as a result of that book, I actually helped a lot of companies improve their fraud systems. And actually became on the advisory board to Arcos Labs, which has possibly the best fraud system I've seen so far outside of eBay. eBay had amazing.
So if you would run, like, imagine you had a huge number of attacks against like slackers and hackers. If you would run something like that today, what different protections, what type of protections would you put in? Are you a fan of WAFs? Like, what would you do things differently or not?
The only thing I would do differently now is I'd have SSL running. Everything else would be identical. Because the way we constructed hackers.org was built on a least privilege model. So I didn't trust the website to not hack me. I didn't trust the website to not be hacked. The network didn't trust the website. The database didn't trust the website or the network, et cetera, et cetera. So everything was like set up in a way that nothing really trusted itself. And so I could have, in fact, I actually created a demo of this, and I gave it to like every OWASP guy I could find, the Metasploit guys, anybody I could find who I thought was good at exploit development. And I gave them 3 vulnerabilities: command injection, SQL injection, and the username and password and URL path to the admin console for a mock website and said, okay, there's credit cards in the database, get them out. That should be well enough for you to do any bad thing you want to do. And not a single person was able to do anything bad other than DOS the site. You can DOS it, but that's it. And so I think that model is still 100% valid. It's complicated. It's not one that most people want to employ, and that's why you don't see it on WordPress installs everywhere. We were running WordPress, but like an archaic, ancient, super vulnerable version of it, like WordPress 2.2 or something, like really, really, really old. And it didn't matter because even though it was vulnerable, even though there's tons of stuff wrong with it, every exploit you could possibly think of basically in it, no one could do anything once they had access. Like there's just nothing that they couldn't write to it, they couldn't change anything about it, they couldn't modify the database. There's nothing they could do to impact it. So from their perspective, even though they knew it was exploitable, it didn't matter. It didn't work. So I don't think I would change anything about the architecture or the design of it, but I wasn't using SSL, and there was some very good reasons I didn't want to use SSL. For instance, I wanted to make sure that people's exploit payloads worked properly, and if they had to know ahead of time whether they should use SSL or not use SSL, there might be SSL TLS mismatch errors, especially if they're using DNS through binding. And so I was very hesitant to use SSL because people were using my site in the way they were using it. But now I think would just be wise to do it. Much later, my buddy, Id, the other guy who was helping me run the site, we found a carnivore box in our network. And we don't know how long it's been there, but it's been there for a very long time. And by virtue of the fact that we weren't using SSL TLS, they didn't need to do any additional exploitation of the website. All they had to do was just watch the wire. So nowadays, knowing that information, I would definitely throw SSL TLS on there, at least to make it a little bit more difficult. So, yeah.
Wow. Okay, to wrap things up, do you have any advice for somebody who wants to? You've started a number of security businesses. Do you have any advice for somebody who wants to do the same? Not the same, but you're doing it in general.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend the same. It's been a tough.
Yeah, not the same, but in general, like security businesses.
Yeah, I think looking for new holes. First of all, you have to be well capitalized. Like marketing to security guys is hard, really hard. People don't open up their email. They don't want to take phone calls. They don't want you to come visit them, especially in COVID. So marketing to security guys is really tough. So you have to be capitalized enough to handle that. The technical side, yeah, there is so much left to be done correctly. But you're ultimately going to have to get bought by somebody, unless you plan to have a unicorn, which most companies will never be. You're probably going to have to be bought by somebody. If you're going to have to be bought by somebody, you have to design your business in a way that's going to be not confrontational or bad for those companies to have in their portfolio, but rather either augments it, complements it, improves it, blocks their competition, makes them look better to like the analysts out there, or in some way improves their ability to function beyond what it is originally. And so it's one of the reasons I went towards what I did. I like the idea of metadata as a source of things. I looked at some of the biggest companies in the world, like Google's, for instance, and like they're selling other people's data. They're selling, metadata from websites, and they're selling your information. That's all metadata. So I like that as a business model because it's very easy to monetize, and it's very easy to build multiple different business models on top of it. If you're going to get into the pizza box play, like a firewall or WAF or whatever, you're definitely going to be in for some tough times because you're selling in a red ocean ecosystem. So if you're going to do that, you've got to have a completely new take on whatever the technology is, and that's going to be a capitalization problem as well. You're going to have enough engineers, enough time, enough runway, and you're going to have to teach people how your product is better. And that's going to mean enterprise salespeople or a very good marketing in some other way. And that's all expensive.
Which goes back to what you were saying about the marketing, that nobody wants to talk to security guys. And with COVID, you definitely can't go visit them.
That's right. So it's tough. Starting a security company today is not impossible, but over COVID we saw a number of big competitors just stop being around. They stopped talking completely. And so I don't know if they disappeared or whether they're just retracting or whether they're focusing somewhere else and they're just heads down while they're doing R&D or what. But I think COVID was rough on a lot of smaller, medium-sized companies that don't have just hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank to spend forever. But we'll see. I think as we come out of this, there's going to be big inflation again. I think people are going to go, security didn't improve. We should probably fix all this stuff. So I'm really excited to see what happens in the next couple of years.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If people want to follow you and where can they find you online?
I'm not really super active on social, but at RSnake on Twitter is probably the one I post to the most these days, I guess. Yeah. Or you can come visit the blog. I post there fairly often, the bitdiscovery.com/blog, I think.
Perfect. I'll put that in the show notes. All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Josh. Have a good day.
All right, that's it for this week. If you have any comments or questions, then tweet at me at Jamoose. And if you got value from this episode, then please share it with a friend. Oh, one minor correction. The BitDiscovery blog is at blog.bitdiscovery.com. See y'all next week.